Nice. 32 degrees. You deserve the luxury.
Nice transition. Okay, well, thank you all for joining us online and for everyone joining us in our watch party. We're so fortunate tonight to have Stanley Chen with us to present via Zoom. Although this is early morning for him, so we're even more fortunate. Thank you so much for waking up bright and early to be with us. We're so grateful to you for that. So Stanley Chen is an award-winning speculative fiction author. His works include the debut novel Waste Tide, which is set in the near future China, haunted by electronic waste, and The Ghost of Extractionism, which is particularly relevant to some of our talks tomorrow as well. And you're also the co-author of AI 2041, 10 Visions for a Future, with Dr. Kai-Fu Lee, which my students who are sitting in the audience today have read as well as part of our class this semester. And so I know that they are very excited to hear your presentation this evening. I know personally, I am really looking forward to this talk because of how well you are able to integrate the speculative fiction in with genuine visions for how we respond ethically to what the future is going to bring us. I think that it's incredible what you're able to do in your work. And I've also really appreciated watching some of your YouTube talks and how well you're able to make some really challenging concepts accessible and engaging for all of us who need to have a stake in this future. So we are so grateful to you to be our keynote for the first day of Ecology East and West, Ecology and Energy Exchange East and West, excuse me, I shorthanded it. And I just want to also express my gratitude to Peter Hershock for both recommending you being our keynote and also for offering support for your talk this evening through the Asian Studies Development Program as well. So thank you so much to our sponsors and thank you to Stanley Chen.
Thanks, Chen. Thanks, Peter, and hello, everyone. Okay. I can feel the vibe in the room. You seems very happy, even the weather is not that right. Yeah, I wish I could join you, but now I'm in China, so I'm gonna share my screen and get started. Can you see my
Yes.
sharing? Okay, perfect. Wonderful. I will keep it like not too lengthy, so because I will have something to do later for dinner and hang out together. So I'll start from okay. So I love the theme we're sharing here, East and West, ecology, energy, and basically I think this is very urgent. And I've been talking to people in China like point of view like NGOs like Greenpeace and etc. So I believe everyone feel the same. Like we are just like the clock here. We're in the it's getting closer and closer, and gonna hit the critical point. Very sooner, maybe it's already there, but we just to close our eyes and pretend we're not seeing it. But what could we do? Because now all the narratives here is quite in the industry and in the COP. I been like 2 years ago in Dubai, the COP 28. So I feel the vibe in the room that everyone's talking about technology and feels like technology is the savior can help us. Of course, is one of the most important piece. I agree, but there's something bigger than technology. to group us together. There's no consensus right now. Like there's no agreement. Because U.S. weak. So I think we need to start think about something, from a very alternative perspective, or even like wild imagination. I think this is where sci-fi as an imaginary artistic form can get into. So I might talk about some background stories about waste time because it was almost discussed. Like back in 12 years ago, um, like everything else in China, it started from a meal on the table. Like everyone's talking about. Around me, I was back to town, Shantou, this small town near the southeast coast of China, Guangdong province, and I met my childhood friends. Some of them work for a U.S. Waste e-waste recycling company in Guangdong province. And he told me, okay, do you know one place very near, like 60 kilometers away, the name Guiyu. So basically, it's the center of recycling all the e-waste from the world. No, I've never heard of this thing. Not in the news, not in our daily life. So basically, no. Is that you have to check it out because it's interesting and I want to put it in the story. I said, that's not something I need to dig out. And this is how it looked like back in 2011 around the time. So I think I did some research, like field study as well. So basically, where you started from late or mid 90s, it is like growing like electronic waste recycling center of the world in a illegal way. So because a lot of this, like you get the motherboard, the cables, chips, broken monitors, everything, were kind of like smuggling. So a lot of immigrant people, this is the kids in our local from the immigrant workers. So basically, it's like the Disneyland. So they play around with cables, motherboards. Is kind of devastating environment. So all these workers, so most of them are from the poorer, less developed area in China, like from Sichuan province. So they work there basically without any protection, without mask, without any gear. So they will disassembling all these pieces with uh, chemicals, acids, burnings. So putting all the waste, the rest of that into the river. So basically the soil, the land, the water, the air is is uh is highly polluted. So even the cancer is highly happen there. The new births. So I think deeper into the topic, and I found, oh, this is something bigger than I expected. So it's not only in China; it's a global issue. And what's most interests me is the inequality behind all of those pollution and damagement. So as you can see from the picture, I found that like maybe over 90% of all those e-waste will shift from developed countries like US, maybe UK, and like only 20% of which has been documented. So which means you couldn't track, you don't know where they're from and where they're shipped to and what it contains and how was the level of, toxication, etc., etc. So basically, this is not only the imbalance of economy, but also the imbalance of geopolitics. And I saw this because most of the situation happening locally, it was all because of lack of legalization on e-waste recycling around the world. So basically, before 2018, there's no such policy like to regulate the importation and the recycling and all this, protection criteria of e-waste in China. So you can see how these developed countries use like use these tricks and to and use it as a bait basically. So local people make some money and local government make some money from recycling all this e-waste, but basically the biggest part of the profit still goes to like the developed countries. iPhone, for example, designed in California, manufacturing in maybe China, like Shenzhen here, or Southeast Asia. But after the whole life cycle of the product, it will go retire, but everything else will go to the developing countries for disassembling and recycling, and all the damages to the environment and to the people stay. So this is how it works, and we can see that like China realized it, and I think interestingly, I published the book Waste Tie in Chinese back in 2013. And that was almost, I think, the same year like Guiyu started to transform. And it took several years to like fully transform to what you can see in the picture is much more like a eco-industrial park, which means you have like better management, you have better insurance for the people, you have better protection. So it causes less pollution to the environment. But also more importantly, in 2018, Chinese government launched the policy to ban like 24 categories of imported waste, including e-waste, which means China is not receiving any e-waste from the rest of the world, especially from the developed countries. And they only take care of our own waste, so from China mainland only. So this causing a huge debate, huge discussion. Sorry, is everything okay? Can you hear this?
I'm muted in the back. Sorry. Your slides are not progressing.
Ah, so yeah, it happens like, but not, can you see it now?
We can see the first slide. It's progressing.
Okay, but how should I do this? Okay, let me share. Yeah, it's weird. Yeah, I know what's happening here. So let me share again. Yeah, it happens. So hmm. So now you can see my slide.
We can see slide 9 now.
Okay. And you can see it moving now.
No.
Okay. Interesting. Um, okay. Yeah, it happened before, but I'm not quite sure what is going on here. Hmm. Oh, can I share it to someone?
I was just gonna say, if you want to share it to me, it's tduncan@uca.edu, and I can pull it up and advance your slides.
Okay. Yeah, I'm saying it right away. Sorry about it.
It's just further that Zoom is impossible for everyone.
Hey Stanley, if you're having problems having it come through, it's working. Did it come through? I was gonna say, you can, just
Yes,
continue.
I'm sending.
Okay, perfect.
Sure. Yeah, I'm sending two formats, just in case, PowerPoint and PDF.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, I might continue. Already the email, so it's a little bit big. So I guess it might take some time to get through. So
That sounds good. Yeah.
yep. Okay, let's get started. Back to the Guiyu. So in 2018, so because basically the government upgrade the whole business model, so they have better, way better environment protection right now. So I think local government or like some NGO did the did the text like for the quality of the air and water. It got uh, tremendously improved since 2018, but the heavy metal in the soil, it might stay for longer, like for centuries. So basically, nobody can grow the crops there. So there's no farming right now. So all these farmers, they move to the city elsewhere. And I think right now, still immigrants working there as base worker. And we can also see this kind of ecology, environmental, or waste conflicts happen across Southeast Asia, like Philippines, Thai, and Malaysia, because you can, if you recognize the news in 2019, there's a huge huge protesting happening in Philippines, Manila, is against all this imported waste from Canada. So it's a huge one. So it shows a, a reality that we usually didn't see as ordinary people, right? So we usually think we dump the trash into the tank and into the trash bin, and it just gone, it disappear. But obviously someone has to take care of it, and some places, some people, some environment suffer a lot from all this, procedure of recycling and handling all this waste from consumerism. And can you, can you receive the doc? So it shows
I
from my
just
side it already.
did.
Okay, great. Wonderful. So I'm on page 10, but you can like fast screening through the previous pages just in case like people have a sense of what I'm talking about. So all of these ideas, basically, I integrate them into my fiction writing on waste time. So people always ask me back then, why don't you just put it as nonfiction? So I think, first of all, I didn't try nonfiction back then. I always a sci-fi guy. So this is the genre I'm quite familiar and comfortable with. And I realized something deeper afterward. So if I put it in a non-fictional way, so all the things, obviously, all the phenomena, all the problems could be nailed down to like Chinese local issue. So it might narrow people's vision, perspective, and didn't recognize, okay, this is something bigger and it's universally exist. And what like intrigued me the most is like after the book got published, not only in Chinese, but some other languages like English, Spanish, German, and maybe some in global South country like South Africa, India, and even Southeast Asia. I got a lot of positive responses, like from the developing countries. Readers told me, okay, I totally feel you. What you describe in the novel is our daily life, basically. And they feel the urgency to stand up and against it. So all this inequality situations happening. And what surprised me is some responses, some feedback from the developed countries, like from US, like Bakerfield in California. So one reader wrote me an email, said, hey, I didn't realize that we did so much thing, like all this e-waste, all the things we bought and got retired, causing all these damages to another corner of the earth, causing a lot of problems and damages, which make him, the reader, reflect a lot, like, what should I do about it? Should I reduce buying stuffs, or should I find another way to better deal with the retired devices, electronics, etc., etc. So which make me really think, okay, this is something beyond nonfiction. So is something only fiction can do. So to resonate with people from different country, from different cultural background, from different belief, to help them to step in the shoes, like see themselves in the character, even as fictional in a way. So I feel the power of storytelling. So when it got bigger and bigger, it also resonate with the movement, the activities in real world. So I got a lot of invitation from all these NGOs and climate change, environmental organization and institute, and even for kids. So they want me to tell the story to younger generation to inspire their imagination and visions for a much more a sustainable future. So I think this is something very meaningful to me, not only writing a fiction, but also like deliver some kind of message to awakening the world, no matter it's like developed country or developing country, no matter it's global north or global south, adult or teenagers. So I think this is something I I didn't really think of it at the very beginning of writing the book. So when I dealing with all these materials in the real world, basically I need to transform it into a science fictional way. Okay, so I have to admit it's safer to get it published here as a science fiction rather than a nonfiction. You might, you understand what I'm talking about. So I have to um, change the space time. So I make up a name like Silicon Isle. So in Chinese, the pronunciation of Silicon Isle is very close, even the same as Guiyu, the original location of the place everything happened. So in Silicon Isle, so in this book, the time was setting interestingly 2026. The only very obvious time step in the book, it was like 2050 year anniversary of USA. So this is the only time I use in the book. So basically next year. And so I also play with different, combination of concepts like e-waste and prosthetics. So which means in the future, in the parallel future, so everyone can replace their limbs, their body parts with artificial ones, but also means when they get retired, we create huge amount of waste. So it's not only e-waste, but also silicon waste and something in between. And it also carry on some unknown like synthetic biological virus per se. So I play around with this kind of like combination of different concepts. Could be like cyberpunkish tradition because I'm from Chaoshan, Teochew. So if you know the people, the culture, the tradition, it was quite unique in China. So we still having all this very ancient ancestral temple. We have all this celebration, and we have all this belief and tradition to worship our ancestor and God and goddess. And we have all these rituals in our daily life. So I put them into a more cyberpunkish style aesthetics to make it like a cognitive estrangement of feeling. So it's what science fiction always do. And also I bring like metaverse or VR, AR, XR technology with it is that some new medium for like local religion to reconnect to the people, especially younger generation. And in the story also is kind of a different channel which across classes. So the waste people have different kind of AR devices and channel to connect their old tribe and even evoke a revolution. So because it needs to be confidential to deliver all this message. And also in the spin-off story, so there will be a VR ancestral temple which people can worship their digital ancestor there to continue their belief and traditions. So all of those is I try to balance, one thing from local is the culture, is the tradition, is good and bad. And one thing is from the, outside world is e-waste, is the capitalism, is the bigger picture of like co-evolution is between human and the machine. So I try to interwove all these different storylines. Like here I put it here. I won't read it through. So I use e-waste recycling as a metaphor to demonstrate the inequality right now we're facing from global north to global south country, from the most developed country to the less developed or developing country or areas, just like climate change situation. And also this island, the Silicon Isle or Waste Isle is like the stage, is like the narrative uh, devices I use, try to making all these dramas and collisions and conflicts happening. And on this island, basically, there are different level of classes, like the local government, like the gangster, like the clans, and the immigrant workers. And also there's some foreigners, as economic hitmen. So they cover up like the investors, like the tech companies. They try to, trading with their most advanced recycling technology, but actually it's like um, um, uh, under the table. Basically, they want something from this island, from the waste recycling, is the rare earth resources, which we know is quite crucial to the like chip technologies and for the military use and even for the space technology. And the waste people, basically, they are the climate of consumerism refugees. So I put it here is quite obvious. They are immigrants and they are the lowest class in the society. They have to suffer from all this damages, toxication from their work, from their laboring, recycling the e-waste, but also they find comforting when they deal with this kind of waste and they try to reinvent all these parts from retarding to put them all together and bring some kind of drug-like experience. So this is what I try to play around with. Even the same technology, even the same devices could be used, utilized into different manner. So depends on the purpose or the subjectivity of the users itself. So this is something I'm quite fascinating about. And so I'm on page 20 right now. Sorry, I should tell you 10 to turn the page if you can follow. Yep. Okay, great. So yep, perfect. Yeah, so I stole some imageries from the illustration from Neuromancer, basically. So you can see how these immigrants using all this waste basically build a very, you know, alternative technological environment for themselves to feeling better, to reconnect to their memories, and even to mobilize the people to self-organize a movement or a revolution to fight against the local clan or to break the system, basically. Next page, please. So yes, so starting from waste tie, I think I kind of, you know, tap into something I never touched before, is the climate change and environmental issue, which I never think of it before. But after receiving all this positive feedback from the rest of the world, I think this is something I definitely should continue doing it. So in the book AI 2041, 10 Visions for a Future, collaborating with Dr. Kai-Fu Lee, basically, I think in the AI-human coexisting future, climate, environmental issues still will be one of the very major concern we are facing with, and how could we again leverage technology, but also with enhance the human agency to make it happen. So I use one story in the book. Next, please. Entitled "Dreaming of Planitude." It was set in Brisbane, Australia. So 10 stories in 10 countries, 10 cities, 10 different cultures. And this is the one again, Brisbane or Australia, they have the plan on 2030 hydrogen city. I think you might heard of the name, but I'm thinking about if we have abundant energy, we have live in a post-scarcity society, what could we do to incent people, especially younger generation, to do what they capable of, or to purchase something we call dream. So I think in the traditional way, we might think, okay, we give them some money, we give them some universal basic income, or I don't know, we have to make them believe something, you know, you have to work because it's about your dignity. It's about your social ladder. It's about how you define yourself, right? But in this story, we think of an alternative way, like we create a digital currency, Mura, so which is in the indigenous language is love, is money, is love. So I think we need some currency of love, currency of self-caring, and also like contribution to the community to renew our value system in the society in a, you know, in a post-scarcity situation. So we need the new gameplay here, not only just, on the materialistic level of demands and fulfill all this lower hierarchy of Maslow's pyramid, but we need to climbing the ladder above that is love, belonging, dignity, and even transcendental experience, like feel you belong to something greater than you. So we think of an indigenous girl who was quite problematic with her identity. We all know the stolen generation story, right? So back in the day when the white colonials stole all these indigenous kids, and I think we borrow the backstory here, but we hope to leverage the technology not only to build a more sustainable society, but to build a more sustainable state of mind for the people. So I think this is something, I think in Chinese is called 天人合一, which means the cosmos and the people, the individual are highly resonate and is basically a part of the holistic worldview. So everything happens as above, so below. So we need to take care of both sides, not only from the outward, but also inward. So which means we need a better interface to communicate with the people, with the individual, and means we need a new exchange mechanism. So in this story, of course, it's a very brief and limited one, but I think the idea here is very interesting. So how can we redesign the economic, the current social mechanism to make it shifting from a more capitalistic, materialistic perspective toward more spiritual, more, meaning making per se stage. Next, please. So from that, I started to write some books for kids. Yeah, because I think the climate change, the energy transformation, and everything is happening. Basically, they are the protagonists. They're the one generation who gonna experience everything. So it's like the most incredible change in their lifetime. So they're gonna experience everything, and they're the ones who make it happen. So if they couldn't understand what is the correlation behind all these super complicated factors, how could we make them believe this is real? So in this book called Net Zero Game, basically I use a very science fictional narrative pattern, which is time traveling. So basically a boy from present day, so he time traveled to the future, like 2060, which is the year like China acclaim might realize the net zero, society. So he witnessed everything, like the technology, like the social and the culture, and even the philosophy of net zero society. And he brings back all this information to present day and becomes an ambassador of sustainable society to spreading the word. So it's very simple and lovely story. And we have the story be read by, I think, over 40 or 50,000 readers at the list, because each one might be read by several, kids. So we have them to write something like some feedbacks and even to draw some illustration to picture their imagination of a net zero future from different perspectives. So I think this is so encouraging. This is very encouraging indeed, because we can see all this different imagination from the kids. It's basically way beyond our current situation. I think without all this information, we couldn't make any change. And next, please. And last year, I published another book is entitled Songs of Mountain and Sea. So it was set in Guizhou province, one of the poorest province in China. And because it's all mountainous area, and it's very difficult to grow crops, and it's very difficult to have all this infrastructure, right? Basically like roads and bridge and everything. So make it very difficult to make the trades and build up anything like manufacturing. But in recent years, basically a lot of, changes there. Like for example, most of the data center, like from Apple, from Huawei, from Tencent, basically there. And they build it in a very eco-friendly way, because I did like 3 trips of few studies there, like one for minority village culture and traditions, and one for the infrastructure, like data center, like the bridge, and like the environmental protection there. And the third one for the fast, like you can see the huge telescope in between the mountains. So I make all this material into a story like a city girl who follow her father, like a tech engineer, to Guizhou area, try to persuade a local minority village to plug in a so-called super cloud. So I make it as a futuristic AI-driven internet. But the problem is it might hurt some of their rituals, some of their traditions, some of their beliefs towards the nature and their ancestor. So the local girl, so from the village, actually is like frenemy relationship. So they experience a series of adventure. So finally, they found a way, like to harmonize, to reconcile, to kind of future. One is more like pre-modern, like more tradition centric, and more spiritual future, and one is more technological, more cybernetic version of future. So I think this is something I really want to argue, that is not like either or. It's not like we can have only one of them. It's not just us or them, but it's like we can have all this, like in quantum physics, superpositioning, right? So we can have integral of 2 different narratives, 2 different versions of imagination about the future. And we should build up a new kind of protocol to better connect to different part of our narrative, our reality. And I think this is a starting point to think how can we access that kind of like non-dualism future. So I will spend more books, stories to unfold and to, I don't know, to actualize it in my narratives, like how this kind of future should look like. Next, please. And also, I just submit the sequel of Waste Tide. It's another novel. For now, the title in English is Infinite Sea. In Chinese, 刹海 is a term from Buddhism. So it means scenes, like scenarios or scenes in the world. So it's a quite abstract, but it means a lot. So it was set in future Maldives, but is already under the sea level. So big tech company, they build a net zero artificial isle, which will host the future COP, like maybe COP 42. But we can witness with the protagonists the failure of the COP system. So this is after the Dubai, and maybe I'll go to Brazil this year. But I think the system is not gonna work anyway. So even we don't have any other option for now, it's too political, is too many, trade-off, is too many debates and discourse. But if we don't have the same consensus, we don't believe in the same thing. So basically we couldn't go anywhere. We couldn't do anything. So think about the Paris and Copenhagen, and yeah, so just it happened. Just repeated the same old history. So I think it's a very complicated situation here, and I try to bring in diverse perspectives, not only from the official perspective, but also from the tech people, indigenous people, activist people, and even from the non-human characters, like such as AI and other species. So it's quite adventurous, I have to admit, because it's, I don't know, it's kind of beyond my capability to manage how to interwove all the storylines and perspective of narratives together. But also interestingly, because the theme of the workshop here is energy. So I use energy as a very key storytelling narrative plot device here. And there's one energy transformation new technology there, but it was proved to be a fraud. So it created a lot of buzz, and it was demonstrated as a showcase in front of global audience, but it's just a gimmick. It just playing with the hope, and it just over promising but under delivery. So all the things will come up with the awakening of the character. So basically, the character is she's also a teenager, so she feels irrelevant to the whole situation around him, around her, around the whole world. She felt numb. She felt hopeless and powerless, and she couldn't care less. But through the whole adventure, basically, she got to her awakening point that she's not an NPC. She's not a non-player character, but she's the protagonist. And she's willing to sacrifice or donate part of her agency to make the change happen. Of course, not only herself, but to connect with some other characters. So it's like a collective intelligence and collective action to make it happen. So I think it's solar punk, but also is, I call it junk punk. So it's waste. It's about some kind of hallucination, not only human, but also the AI hallucination. And also it creates something very different from like dystopian, utopian, dualism, imagination. So it's something, I think, I don't know. I think we just need to bring in something new here to talk about the climate change and ecology, environment, and energy here. And yeah, I can't wait to have it published in Chinese and some other languages. And I wish to hear the feedback of the people, not only from the sci-fi readers, but also from the people who's doing the real job, doing the real research in the field. And I think this is only the beginning of everything, because in Chinese Eastern mysticism, so 2024 is the beginning of a 20-year cycle. So it will last till 2044. So this is a huge transition towards a more spiritual, more female-centric, and more dynamic future. Of course, there will be fire, there will be war, and there will be a lot of conflicts, and maybe there will be huge, like, I don't know, systematic failure, but there'll be something new emerge from that ash. So I think we're experiencing a historic transformation right now in human history. And I'm so happy to be here with you. And yes, and next, please. And I think this is where the Qiufan should get in place. I don't need to repeat the names here. Everyone knows it. And next, please. And yes, we can see all these approaches of Qiufan to scare people away or from our very near future daily life of changes, or from a very optimistic system design or technology risk solution of the problem, like Kim Stanley Robinson. And I think maybe we need them all, and maybe we need something new as well. Next, please. So why all this artistic and imaginary narratives matter in a climate changing world? Next, please. Next, please. So I think it could counterbalance the cognitive asymmetry, because I think, like, people, we have this kind of very linear speculation about the future, but actually the reality happened in a very non-linear way. So we have all this asymmetry on cognition. So I think fiction, climate fiction especially, because climate change, it happened in a way bigger scale, space-time, compared with human lifespan. So we barely can experience it in a, how the temperature might go up by how many Celsius degree. It's very difficult for human to perceive and to capture all these changes. But in fiction, basically, we can compress all this space-time into a way shorter narratives. And also we can expand from local to a universally existing situation like e-waste. And we can use narrative to help people think beyond their own self, like from a very human-centric perspective, a more broader spectrum of seeing everything, seeing different things and feeling different things from a totally different sensory schema. So I think this is something very crucial here. Next, please. And I think we urgently need some new aesthetics or metaphorical minds, because, you know, the old stories, when you use the same old narratives, same old aesthetics, it gets outdated and people get numb and maybe get bored of all this old-fashioned things. And I think fiction is always about discovering something new and exploring some novelty of our daily experience, of our inner conscious flows, or our understanding of the world. So I think this is something you're not restricted to very, you know, academic research, because you need all these references, you need very logical coherency. And in fiction, you can be a little bit loosen from your, you know, daily routine. You can have your you can have all these possibilities. You open up a space of potential. So I think this is so crucial for people to loosen their hands, loosen their minds, so they can see the invisible reality. Next, please. And also, I hope all these narratives, all these fictions can motivate individual to participate in all these actions or movements, or even just spreading the word, spreading the ideas about the future. And I'm so encouraged by the young people. So because every time when I talk to them, they make me feel there's still some hope there. And so every time I feel depressive because all the news, everything happened around the world. So I need to talk to some younger ones. And that's why I started to teach in the university. And I think this is where I get my energy, where get my momentum moving forward from. So I think this is also very important to me. So sci-fi, cli-fi, fiction as a motivation for social changes. Next, please. So I will end this with 3 quotes about the future. So William Gibson's "The future is already here, just not evenly distributed." So it's very capitalistic, right? So everyone knows it. So, and my favorite one actually from Ursula Le Guin. She said, "The future is already full. It's much older and larger than our present, and we are the aliens in it." So this is from a very Taoist perspective, in my opinion. So because the future is already full of all concepts, all ideas, all imaginations. So there's no space for new one to grow, to develop. So how can we build the new future within the old framework, within the old traditional mindsets? But this is the reality we are living in. But we need to use all these older and larger resources of thoughts, and we need to build something totally brand new from it. And in that kind of future, basically, we will feel so strange. We will feel maybe incomprehensible when that kind of future arrives. And the last one, I think this is from the book AI 2041. And with every future we wish to create, we must first learn to imagine it. So this is what I believe. And I believe if people couldn't envision the future they want to create, so basically there's no way they can actualize it. But it's not taken for granted. So not everyone can easily know how to imagine a future. So we need to learn. So it means there's some skill, there's some methodology to teach like the people, younger generation, how to imagine a plausible, constructive, positive future, and how can we use the narrative? How can we put all this imagination concrete enough into the narrative, into the storytelling, and spreading all this message with the medium of everything, technologies, performances, and even like social interaction. So I think this is something I try to broaden the concept of like storytelling. Basically, everything could be storytelling and everything could be fiction. And what we should do is to help people to open up their mindset, because they were trapped in this, algorithmic recommendation cocoon, and basically they just saw what they want to see and they couldn't see what they don't know. And this is the huge problem with the generative AI here. So I think I'll stop here and open to any question if you had any. So I'm love to answer any of them. So thank you all. I think I couldn't hear you.
We're unmuting.
Perfect.
So thank you all so much for being patient with some of our technical issues. And thank you so much for an excellent presentation. We have a little bit of time for some questions. And if someone has a question on Zoom, if you want to type it into the chat, we can make sure that that gets through as well. No questions?
I have a question.
Sharon has a question.
You mentioned this briefly, but I had noticed that a lot of your characters were girls or women, and I was wondering why you chose that and how that decision affected your writing and your work.
Just in case you couldn't hear that with the microphone, the question was about the reoccurrence of girls and women as main characters.
Right. I think this is a very good question, because I think gender issue are also part of the bigger problems here. And in waste type, basically you can see Mimi as the waste worker. So she's the broken one. She's the sacrificed one. And I was asked by the US publisher, editor, so why she has to be saved by a male? I totally understand the woke thing here, but I mean, in reality, especially in that occasion, so immigrant worker, usually the female ones are the ones who suffer more, who's weaker in the social construction, and who will have more power, more resilience, fighting against status quo. So I think we should encourage people to think in that way, that I think it's a quite masculine system. I'm not only saying China, basically. I'm saying about all this technology, community is very masculine. And I think also it shapes how the technology looks like right now, right? And in Chinese philosophy, so there's no yin, there's no yang. So it's two counter but interchangeable, intercomplete parts of reality, of energy. So I think we need more feministic narratives here. And also I think they are more open to changes. In my personal experience, they are more cognitive fluidity. They accept way better than, sorry to say that, male in my life to, accept new things, to learn new things. And I think, but of course, not necessarily female, but I think it's also about female character, female feature, female kind of, social construction, how to help us to imagine a different kind of technology and narratives. And I think why there's two girls met together, I think because they both, in both society, in both like in minority part village, so basically they worship the goddess. So the goddess is the one who take care of all these wishes, worships, and take care of the people on the ground. So the girl want to become another medium, to communicate with the goddess, the divine part. And but from the other side, the girl from the city, so basically she studied all this science and technology. She living a AI dominant society, and she feels so depressed. She feels so bleak, and she needs some, exit to it. And but she's kind of afraid and resisting the minority reality. So because she felt that's pretty modern and everything is without, AI, and it couldn't talk anyway, but it's weird, but it's uncomfortable. But after all, so they might know, okay, this is not totally the opposite, but it could be two faces of the same reality, of the same future. So I think this is something, so I think this is something inspired me a lot from real life. So I got a lot of inspiration from my female friends, even from my students, and they expressively tell me a lot about how they feel about the world. And I think, okay, this is the information I got, so I need to put it in my stories. And I feel, okay, this is what I should do. And I'm not sure if I answer your question, but I think, I might try some non-binary characters, because I use that on my AI character, because we all picture AI as male, female, sometimes is too binary. But I think AI should be non-binary. It should be, gender fluidity there. And it might help us to step out of our, this kind of, dualism framework of thinking as well. And so this might be the theme I might gonna explore in my forthcoming books. Thank you.
Yeah, that was wonderful. Thank you. Anybody else? Are you comfortable speaking up into the microphone? Where's the mic?
It's attached to the camera.
Okay, so aim your question toward the camera on the tripod.
Okay. I just basically am very grateful and looking forward to reading your novels. But I'm wondering if you might reflect a little bit more on how the work of imagination, which is so important to the inspiration of a new aesthetic and therefore a new reality that you're talking about, works in relation to energy, since our conference is on energy. I'm just wondering if there's something about imagination that energizes possibilities. I just love to hear your voice on that.
Yes, I think, yeah, basically, I think the solution we saw right now is quite limited, right? So there's like either or options there. So even I think it took longer than we expected to get to net zero, but I think right now it seems like a closed source game, you know, it's like a zero-sum game. So all these fossil energy ones might totally not happy about what we're doing towards like clean energy. So because it's a zero-sum game, but I think maybe there's some alternative way there. But also think about EV. So because China now is the biggest EV exported country, not only the vehicle, but also the technology, the solution. But think about what about the retired EV? Think about all the batteries. Think about, right, so it's a huge problem out there. So it's already some problems there. So how should we deal with all these retired devices? And I think we were trapped here. So, and from of course, I'm just a writer. I know nothing about it, you know, real thing. I just make it up. I think because we were trapped in this capitalistic way of thinking to make it profitable and, you know, scaling up everything as fast as possible. But think about, you know, I know the degrowth movement back in the day. So I've been thinking about it all the time. So if we just make everything slower down, right? So if we don't need that much computation power, if we can live with a lower, you know, emission lifestyle. So I'm not talking about just, you know, less traveling or something. I mean, something totally paradigm shifting thing. And can we just make the earth like Gaia recovering itself? And maybe we should learn something from the nature as well. So I think everything we are doing here is basically mimicking what the nature has been doing for billions of years. So what we really need to do is to look back or look deeper into the history of revolution to finding some solutions there. And yeah, so I think that's why I think we need some wild imagination and like outliner aesthetics to make people feel what is happening. And in the novel, in the forthcoming novel, in Infinite Sea, I basically I use Gaia and Medea metaphor, and I said, okay, now Gaia is transformed into Medea. She's killing all her baby right now. And what we should do is we should embody it spiritually, not only intellectually, to feel it, to connect with it. So in the story, I make up something, of course. But I mean, in reality, we also need that kind of thing, but only through art. Only through art and the nature, we can reconnect to the earth, the environment, and only we can feel the pain, only we can suffer what it's suffering, we can really, you know, understand what is going on, and we can come up with something different from technology and profitability and everything. And yeah, so I think this is maybe a little bit off, but I think, yeah, after the COP experience, I really think, oh, there's nothing really getting there from all these politicians and, technicians and and yeah, all this old monies and yeah. But I know it's kind of difficult. It's always difficult. Oh, I saw Thomas. Thomas, he has another. Okay, no worries.
Yeah, just to send his thanks. Well, if we don't have any other questions, I know you've got other things that you have to do today too, and I appreciate you again taking time in your early morning to share this with us. I'm so sorry again about the issues that we were having with your PowerPoint, but if you don't mind, could I share the slides with the folks so they could see the ones we skipped over?
Sure.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much, Stanley. Everybody, please join me in thanking. Thank you so much. Have a
Enjoy.
great day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Bye.